trust my own judgment about other people, as well as myself. Previously, I'd compare my actual feelings to whatever Scientology said I was supposed to feel. If I felt anything else, then surely the problem was with me. As a result, I doubted myself constantly. I doubted whether I was a good person. I doubted whether the people around me were good people. I doubted whether my emotions were appropriate, all because Scientology made me feel that I was the problem. Now, for the first time, I was able to see myself for what I was. Someone who made mistakes and was trying to make up for them. I might not have made great decisions, but that didn't make me bad, and it certainly didn't make me evil. Evil was where they made their mistake. I might have had doubts, but I came to recognize that I was not evil. If there was one thing I was certain of, it's that I cared about other people. I cared about my friends tremendously and would have put them before myself at any moment. I knew I was not an SP because SPs did not feel that way. I knew without a doubt that I was a good person, and no matter what anyone else thought or said about me, no matter who they were or how important, I didn't care. When I realized this, down to the moment, the clouds opened up. This realization was the beginning of personal integrity, when, instead of dismissing my feelings or my intuition, I found myself following them, even if they led me to a place that Scientology said was wrong. It was amazing. Now when I got yelled at, I would just say, "Yes, sir," so flatly, unconvincingly, and meaninglessly that I was starting to piss people off. I wouldn't let them get to me. I would even smile a little bit, because I knew that I wasn't listening and they were getting so worked up. At staff meetings, I would get called on in front of the whole group to tell them my flap, which was stuff that had come up in my sessions. Maybe it was that I had smiled at my friend, which was the same as not concentrating on my studies, or I might have chatted for 1 minute with Mayra instead of working like a slave. Anything I did wrong had to come up in my sessions. "Jenna, do you have a flap?" the CO would demand from me in front of everybody. "No, not other than the one that everyone already knows about, and that I already announced last week," I'd offer. This would undoubtedly be an opening for an attack on me. "Oh, real smart, Jenna. Be a smartass to your CO in front of everybody. Change your attitude or you will go straight to cleaning pots and pans in the galley." She used me as an example for the entire group of how not to act. Tom's wife, Jenny, was at Flag now, and was holding my mom's old post in the watchdog committee. I still had fond memories of the time I had spent with her when I had come for my Key to Life course. She asked to speak to me alone, hoping to get me to see things differently. She told me that she had been in trouble a few times and didn't always agree with what she had to do as a result, but she had pushed through it by reciting LRH's 2 rules for happy living. 1, be able to experience anything, and 2, cause only those things which others are able to experience easily. I wasn't sure I totally got her point, but I thought she was on my side. But the next day, in front of everyone, she directly told me that I had been given so much, and I needed to be grateful and show compassion. I was dumbfounded. "Compassion?" I asked. "Are you serious?" The reason I was in trouble wasn't that I needed to show compassion, it was that I'd shown too much compassion. I had befriended people that they considered too far below them to be worth befriending. I couldn't help but think how contradictory and pompous a respected authority was sounding. All I had done was try to make Kiri feel safe, because I had once been scared in the same way that she was. I was trying to advocate for the greater good, and instead I was made to feel like a selfish, entitled brat. At the moment, I wasn't under the impression that the CMO was all about serving mankind. It seemed like it was more about tightening the clamps. Jenny just dismissed my outburst with a laugh. That was so Jenna. I had no idea what she meant by that, but at least I didn't get in trouble for backflashing. After a couple of months, Mr. Rathbun turned my sec check sessions over to Jelena, a CMO auditor. In our sessions, Jelena would wear a headset and a mic. Many times I could hear people yelling directions at her through the headset, telling her questions to ask me, which resulted in many 8-hour sessions. The only way I got through it was by answering as quickly as I could and by trying to float the needle by thinking happy thoughts, a task that, of late, had gotten increasingly difficult. One day, after a couple of months on the EPF, I was finally allowed to go to school on a Sunday with everyone else. It was there that I saw Martino. For the day, I was now under the watch of Stephen, a little CMO boy, as Mayra was too old to go to school. I saw that Martino, who was doing messed work, was under watch too. One time, when Stephen was lagging behind, I ducked into the room that I knew Martino was in. He looked very wary as I approached. I beckoned to him so that we could talk, but he glanced at the two people watching him, who were eyeing me suspiciously. I signaled to him to come anyway. His guards looked at each other, and then looked away, meaning they would pretend that they didn't see. They were just cadets, after all, not as hardcore as the people in CMO who were watching me. My tears started welling up as he came over. "I am so sorry," I whispered to him. "I never meant any of this to happen. I begged them to leave you out of everything, and I feel horrible that I got you into this." He cut me off, taking responsibility. "Oh my gosh, this is not just your fault," he said. "Don't even say that. I feel like I've ruined everything for you. You are on the CMO EPF now," he said apologetically, gesturing to my uniform. Just then, little Stephen walked up. "What is going on here?" he asked with the seriousness of a police officer but the voice of a little boy. He was only 10, and about a foot shorter than me. It would have been hard to take him seriously in any situation, but as my guard it was downright disturbing how authoritative a little boy could be when given a little bit of power. Martino put his hand on mine briefly before he turned to go. The two boys watching him were his friends, and he was likely to be safer after this brief chat than I was. Now that Martino had left, I looked at Stephen pleadingly, hoping he would not say anything. Stephen had been my friend prior to all of this. I had even saved him from the wrath of Julia once, and hoped that he would return the favor. But no such luck. A few minutes later, he was on the phone reporting what had happened. About 30 minutes later, someone had driven the org car to the Quality Inn to get me. School was over before it had started. I was no longer allowed to go there. The cycle felt impossible to defeat. Even if I behaved perfectly, things would keep coming up that pulled me back. It was exhausting. Finally, after months of me being a stain on the face of the universe, my CO asked me what was stopping me from getting through my program. I was honest. I told her that I couldn't get over some of the claims that had been made about me, that I ran to my parents on every whim, and that I had been the cause of the closing of the ranch. I also took issue with the amount of flap my using the phone had created. I told her that, from what my ranch friends were telling me on the down low, they called their parents at INT all the time. I requested a conversation with Aunt Shelley. She agreed to talk to me, seeming both reluctant and relieved, as if she had wanted to talk for some time. The meeting took place in one of the auditing rooms in the WB. Shelley was curt and standoffish when she came in, greeting me with a hello instead of her usual hug. After telling her about my progress, I got into my disputes of the claims against me. When I began getting specific, she became very angry. "I took time out of my day to talk to you, and now you just want to tell me I was wrong? Even if some claims against you aren't absolutely accurate, plenty of things in your ethics file are." She let that sink in before continuing in a softer tone. "In my opinion, your troubles stem from misunderstood words on course, specifically those in Vol 0, and you just need to go back and clear them." This was her way of acknowledging that it wasn't all my fault, or simply because I was a bad person. I thought she would leave it at that, but she had a warning about men, too. Many guys who are hungry for power and eager for information marry CMO girls for this purpose and wind up bringing the girls down. You need to watch out for that, because it's been proven in history. Although she didn't say as much, I could tell that I would be somewhat pardoned now. The part about men suggested that she thought some of this was Martino's fault, that I was his unsuspecting victim and should stay away from him and clear my MUs. Shelley even gave me a hug after we talked. Miraculously, the next day, the attitude about me had changed. Aunt Shelley had obviously been receptive to at least part of my self-defense, because she seemed to have had a change of heart that quickly spread to everyone around her. Initially, she had wanted to make it known that it wasn't acceptable to disagree with her and get away with it. On the other hand, I thought her anger might have been obligatory, as though perhaps my uncle was the one pissed about my fraternizing and Aunt Shelley had to display the anger or she'd be in trouble herself. Whatever the underlying cause, she must have been tired of being mad at me, because she certainly calmed down. Now, instead of being viewed as the enemy of the group, I was seen as having made huge steps toward recovery and on my way back to being in everyone's good graces. At the time, I simply accepted the change for what it was, a welcome relief. But looking back, it represents as clear an indication as anything about just how much sway Uncle Dave and Aunt Shelley had over people. For months, I'd been tormented and insulted. I'd been embarrassed and harassed. I'd been put in my place and told that I was the lowest of the low. Yet, in spite of all that, it took just one conversation with Aunt Shelley to put things on a path to improvement. While the situation worked to my benefit in this case because Aunt Shelley clearly had a soft spot for me and decided to forgive me, it also made me afraid of what could happen if Uncle Dave or Aunt Shelley simply didn't want to forgive someone. None of this forgiveness meant I was excused from having to repeat the CMO EPF. However, I was allowed to have brief conversations with my friends from the ranch, although I was still not allowed to fraternize. Soon, many of the kids from the Flag Cadet org came on the EPF, including Martino, Jasmine, and Cece. It was cool because my flag friends made great friends with all my ranch friends, especially BJ, who had been struggling since coming out from the West Coast. They took him under their wing almost as a favor to me. I was finally allowed to graduate in November 1999, having been on the CMO EPF for 5 months. Back as a good standing member of CMO, I was given a new post, Flag Crew Programs Operator. Flag Crew was 500 people strong and responsible for running the 5 hotels and 4 restaurants that the public Scientologists who had come to Clearwater for services used. Each hotel had its own maids and maintenance, and the restaurants had hosts, servers, cooks, dishwashers, and busboys. As programs operator, I ran programs to resolve organizational dysfunction. I loved this post far above and beyond being on full-time study. I had a job, which was all that I had ever wanted. I wasn't holed up in a course room all day, but had freedom to walk around the building. I got to meet new people, make friends, and feel like I was producing something. My boss, the operations chief, was a really cool guy. He was smart, helpful, and reasonable, and appreciated that I was a hard worker. Occasionally, I was scolded for wearing my civilian clothes inappropriately. For PR purposes, we were allowed to wear civilian clothes on Sundays, but my CO often had to tell me to put on something less tight and better suited for my position, as I was not a little girl anymore. For my part, I didn't think my clothes were out of line. I hardly saw Martino anymore. After he graduated from EPF, he was posted as someone who carried pre-clear folders to and from the case supervisors, but that was not my area, so I rarely went there. Once or twice I did try to go through the hotel to see if I might run into him, but I never did. In spite of everything that had happened, I was still in love with him and still thought about him all the time. I heard rumors that other girls liked him, so I figured that he was probably caught up in that. I also knew that he had been threatened with the RPF if he messed up again. Still, I remained close with our mutual friends. Christmas 2000 came and went, just another Christmas spent away from my family. Gone were the years of flying out to Int for the beer and cheese party and the ski lodge trip with the Miscavige family. I hadn't spoken to my parents since July, before I'd gone on the CMO EPF. Although I did get occasional letters, more from Dad than Mom. I don't know why, but them being back together gave me a sense of stability, making me feel like things were a little bit more like they had been before Dawn and before Mom's RPF. I guessed they both saw Mom's affair as something that had happened as a result of them being separated for so long. For all practical purposes, it didn't really matter, because I saw them so rarely. As time went by, I became more successful at keeping Martino out of my thoughts. I switched my school day so that I wouldn't run into him on Sundays. During course time, I started sitting near a kid named Will, who was tall and cute. I could tell he liked me, because he always saved me a seat. Cool and funny, he also played guitar, which of course impressed me. I liked talking to him because he always listened. He hadn't grown up in the Sea Org, so I was fascinated when he would tell me about his life in the WOG world. I never felt the same way about Will as I had about Martino, however, even though I was moving on. It was all good until one day after school when I was waiting for the bus back to the hacienda with everyone else. Will, waiting with me, was holding my hand to see me off. All of a sudden, I saw Martino race by, clearly trying to avoid the sight of us. We no longer had the same school day, so it was really weird. I hadn't seen him in ages. The following week, I was walking into the course room and over to my seat near Will. Sitting on the other side of him was Martino, a huge grin on his face. I had deliberately changed my school day to avoid him and stay out of trouble, and now he was sitting at my table. I was annoyed and even a little angry with him. I felt that he had just become disinterested in me, and I was hurt by that. Although it could have been that the reason he was avoiding me was that he was trying to stay out of trouble. Whatever the case, I was trying hard to get over him, and I believed I was. Martino seemed to be enjoying all the discomfort he was creating by being there, which made me even more annoyed. I grabbed Will and we moved next door, but Martino moved too, again sitting right at our table. I wanted to strangle him, but even Will seemed to think it was a little funny but awkward. I just couldn't figure out why Martino was doing this. I had finally moved on and he was intruding. I decided to act as if he wasn't there. The next week things got worse. I had recently gotten word about Justin, whom I hadn't heard from in well over a year. A ranch friend visiting Flag had recently spoken to him and had his number. I decided to call him during lunch. The area code was LA, so I figured he must be living there. While he was out of the Sea Org, I thought he might still be a Scientologist to some degree. Some girl who answered the phone put him on. When he said hello, he was not excited in the least, even though I was practically giddy. At first he acted as if he had no idea who I was. Eventually, after prodding and probing, he came clean. "Look, I don't give a shit about my family. They don't mean anything to me. You're with Ronnie and Biddy doing their thing, and I don't want anything to do with them either." "But, Justin, I'm not with them. I haven't spoken to them in forever. What does your problem with them have to do with me?" It was no use, though. He couldn't be reasoned with. "I don't give a shit about them. I don't give a shit about you. I don't have a sister." And with that, he hung up the phone. I was devastated. I had no idea what had just happened or why, and I had taken a risk by calling him. When I got back to class, I was barely holding it together. Though I hadn't spoken to Justin since he'd left the Sea Org, I never expected our first conversation would be like that. I never expected the anger that he had. His words confirmed my worst fear when he walked out of Flag almost 2 years earlier, that he was lost to me. Worse, it was of his own choosing. Will was oblivious, but Martino, who was back to sitting at our table again, could see I was upset and asked me what was wrong. I tried as hard as I could not to cry as I told him about the phone call. Martino was empathetic and said, somewhat jokingly, that he was going to kick Justin's ass, which made me laugh because my brother was so much bigger than Martino. For his part, Will sat quietly, not even part of the conversation. When he went to the bathroom a few minutes later, Martino put his hand on mine. I could have moved it, but I didn't. The rest of the day went by quickly. When it was time for the bus, Will tried to kiss me goodbye, but I dodged it, causing him to ask me outright if it was because of Martino. I lied and told him it wasn't. I just wanted to slow it down. For the next week, I tried to avoid Will, but he simply could not be avoided. Will kept paging me and cornering me. Finally, he had a libs day and was not in school, which left Martino and me alone to talk. We were back in sync in no time, talking about everything and commiserating. Now that he was a Sea Org member, he wasn't scrutinizing Scientology in quite the same way, but that was fine with me. I wasn't either. And that difference didn't change how comfortable we were around each other. When we walked around, he leaned into me just as he always had, and all of my feelings rushed back. Later that week, I just had to tell Will that I still had feelings for Martino. He was sad and had suspected as much. He was really upset when I broke it off with him, but I preferred to tell him rather than string him along. After that, Martino and I went back almost to how things had been before everything fell apart. At school, we'd sit next to each other in the course room with our legs intertwined under the table, and during breaks, we talked to each other. Once again, school day was my favorite day of the week. One afternoon, while we were waiting for the bus, we talked about how not being able to date was such a drag. We were both in Sea Org, so we should be allowed to. The issue was that Aunt Shelley and Anne Rathbun forbade it. It was all unspoken, but she essentially had determined that he was bad news, so I was constantly being watched. I had already done bad things with him, so for me to go back to him would show that I hadn't changed. "Look, Jenna," he said, catching my eye but then looking down at his feet. I'm at the point where I'm not sure I even care about the trouble we might get into." And with that, he pulled me close and kissed me. Chapter 21. Security Checks. That night, I went home and told all the girls in my dorm that Martino had kissed me. I was so happy I couldn't stop myself. Despite the risks, Martino and I began to see more of each other. Because he was no longer a cadet, technically we were allowed to see each other. However, from the reprimands Aunt Shelley and Mr. Rathbun had given me, I knew that they forbade the two of us from being together. During the week, we would talk, but always had to hide. Someone would inevitably walk in, so we would just have enough time to quickly grasp hands before I slinked away. By the end of September, I was in a better place than ever before. I loved my job. I had a ton of friends both inside and outside the CMO, even if it were on the down low, and all my childhood friends from the ranch were now at Flag. Best of all, I was finally going to be with Martino. I should have known it was all too good. More important, I should have listened to my friends when they warned me that Martino and I should be careful, as it was the same time of year we had gotten in trouble the first time. A few days later, Mr. Rathbun called me into her office. She said we were going to do a metered interview. She had all sorts of weird questions, some about my parents' old coin collection and others about a bunch of photographs, and if I had seen them before. Mr. Rathbun said the photos were on a roll of film that I had sent to my dad. One was a photo of my roommate, Mayra, which I'd taken without realizing she was in her underwear with a shirt on. Over the course of several months, I'd taken a bunch of other photos and sent the whole roll to my dad so that he could have them developed. I was a bit confused as to how she'd gotten hold of the photos, but odd as the questions were, I was more focused on the fact that she had yet to ask me about Martino. I figured I'd cooperate in any way I could so that I wouldn't draw her attention to him. Still, the interview went uncharacteristically smoothly, and Mr. Rathbun said she would let me know if she had any other questions. Perhaps best of all had been the fact that she hadn't asked a single question about Martino. Unfortunately, the next day she called me in again. This time she started asking more personal questions and if I was hiding anything. Exactly the questions I'd been thankful to escape the previous day. She didn't seem to know anything that was happening with Martino, but she was also asking questions about my parents. I tried to sidestep her questions, but she wouldn't have it, and apparently neither would the e-meter. "I am going to find out what you're hiding," she said in an ominous tone. Finally, after several hours of intense questioning, I broke down. I told her the truth about kissing Martino. First, she wanted to know why I felt the need to hide it, which I thought was a really stupid question. Then she made me tell her every single detail, from how close we were to each other when we kissed, to how long it lasted, to what my intentions were, to what led up to it, to every minuscule thought and action. Revealing all those details about such a private moment was excruciating. They were the kinds of personal details that should have been insignificant to everybody but me. Not to mention that, had it not been for Aunt Shelley and Mr. Rathbun's stance against Martino, he and I would have been allowed to kiss. Out 2Ds only applied to heavy petting and sex, so I wasn't sure why I was being subjected to this detailed interrogation. When it was over, I was sure I was in serious trouble, but instead, Mr. Rathbun said I could return to post. Unsure of what to prepare for, I told Martino about the session, and he seemed worried for me but also acted as though he didn't care what she thought. In his opinion, we weren't doing anything wrong, so there was no reason to be afraid. 2 days went by, making me think I was in the clear, until I was summoned again. This time, Mr. Rathbun informed me that I was getting another security check, which again would last several weeks. The first withhold I gave up for this sec check was my confession that I had gotten my belly button pierced a few weeks back, during my first Libs Day in months. I had it done for my 16th birthday in the company of my cousins, some of their friends, and Aunt Denise, who signed the consent form as my mother. My grandmother had warned me that it would get me in trouble, but I had done it anyway. Bizarrely, Mr. Rathbun seemed to be cool with it, but her news about Martino was even better. "Just put things on hold with him for a bit, Jenna," she told me, "just while this security check is going on. After that, you guys can pick up where you left off." I couldn't believe she'd actually said those words. Painful as it would be not to see him for a bit, if it meant that in a few weeks Martino and I would no longer have to sneak around, it would be worth it. The next time I saw Martino, I told him the news. He was bummed and annoyed that we had to wait, but I told him that I would get through it quickly. He wasn't thrilled, but decided to trust me. A few days later, I saw him when he was with his mother, a boisterous Italian woman with a huge personality who I liked in her own right, regardless that she was Martino's mother. She leaned toward me to whisper that I should be strong and not feel bad, because bad people only pick on the good people. She gave me a hug, and Martino grabbed my hand, smiled sadly, told me to hurry and get through this, and walked away. It was the last time I ever saw him. That afternoon, Mr. Rathbun had a surprise for me. In her office were my two superiors, my CO and the ops chief. In the same fashion as Aunt Shelley, she castigated me, saying I was grossly out ethics and that I belonged on the RPF. I couldn't understand what had changed since my last session. She was totally hurtful. She told me in no uncertain terms that my so-called friends only liked me because of my name, and that I was a rock slammer at heart. I just hadn't rock slammed yet. She was so completely different than she had been the last time we met. I felt betrayed. Immediately, Mr. Rathbun ordered that I be put under full-time watch and back into a CMO EPF uniform, though I wasn't actually on EPF. I had to clean the bathrooms and stairwells endlessly. The new head of our department had to stay with me. She would stand around in the stairwell or the bathrooms for several hours while I cleaned. She was pulled from her duty and replaced, however, when word got out that she had warmed up to me and was even telling me Harry Potter stories to help pass the time. Upset as I was about this, I found myself much more in control of my emotions than I had been after I'd submitted the petition to Aunt Shelley to rejoin the cadet org. In part, because I'd been so happy with how my life was going, I was interested in simply fulfilling my tasks and getting things back to normal. I simply did what I had to do, so that sooner or later they would let me go back to Martino and my life. Different as my reaction was this time, something still bothered me about my punishment. I wasn't sure what I'd done to deserve it. Sure, I'd been hiding things with Martino, but again it was a situation where the punishment didn't fit the crime. I hadn't broken a Scientology law. All I did was go against what Aunt Shelley and Mr. Rathbun had said. I honestly had no idea why I was punished to this degree. Yes, I had been with Martino, and yes, I got my belly button pierced, but those weren't against policy. Sometimes I slacked off a few times when I should have been working, but no more so than anyone else. Other offenders didn't have RTC waiting to sec-check them any time they looked sideways. Why was this the case for me? When I wasn't cleaning, I was going through grueling security checks with Mr. Rathbun. They were laden with questions tailor-made just for me. Have you used your name inappropriately to get your way? Do you have an evil intention against your uncle? Security checks were the church's ultimate control mechanism, and the sessions were all videotaped. In most cases, they used security checks to keep you cleaned up to get you back onto the bridge. However, in my case, they were used to keep me in line. I got sec checks because I nattered, disagreed, was difficult, or because I was frequently upset, which was considered arc-breaky. Between the ages of 12 and 15, I had at least 8 security checks. No other staff member that I was aware of had this many in such a short period of time, unless, of course, they were on the RPF. I hated the security checks and never understood why I had so many. Anytime someone was upset or disagreed with something in the organization, the church said it was because you had withholds. Any criticism you had, anything you didn't agree with, essentially any dissent you had, was because you had done something bad. That was how they shut people up. In addition to looking at my life in search of withholds, I was encouraged and expected to look into my past lives to find answers about earlier similar withholds that had caused me to act out. I wasn't allowed to jump right into past lives. I had to get there slowly, answering all my auditor's questions as they were presented. If my e-meter indicated I was on an earlier similar path, I was encouraged to continue. This emphasis on past lives always made me feel as though I were making up answers, but it also made things easier. When I couldn't come up with any real withholds, which was more often than not, it helped to be able to delve into a fantastical world of past lives where anything was possible. Sometimes I would feel better, but it could have just been because I was getting off the subject of my current life withholds and was able to talk about some imaginary life, which was easier and a huge relief. As long as the auditor said the e-meter showed that I was on the right track, there wasn't any skepticism about what I was saying. Nobody was verifying any of my stories with actual science. Many people would make up all kinds of exaggerated stories. They would come up with overts in which they would confess to blowing up planets with bombs and outlandish things like that. They would come up with elaborate plots and detailed characters that were often hard to believe. I was more restrained. I never created fully realized characters or in-depth stories. I wasn't bold enough to act as though I knew it all for sure. I used my past life memories strategically, when I thought they would help move a session along. Often my past lives were some alternate version of myself. Usually I was just some girl in a scene, a piece of a larger past life that I would never see. I would supposedly remember being a girl hundreds of years ago, who was poor and had to steal something. Another time I remembered being a girl being chased down the street by an evil, scary man, and I wound up killing him. At the time, I imagined that this bad man was an image from a past life and was the reason I was scared at night, or anxious and paranoid that I was being followed. Often it was something taken straight out of a movie I had seen or a book I had read, but I made it my own. My needle would always float at the end, so I wasn't about to argue with that. I was never fully convinced that the needle had to do with my story's accuracy. I was always told that as I moved up the bridge, my recall of past lives would improve greatly. Faking my way through the past lives didn't make me skeptical about the whole practice, though. I'd known about past lives my whole life, and while I felt like a bit of a fraud for not experiencing them fully, I sometimes managed to convince myself that they were indeed past lives, especially if convincing myself meant that I could get out of session more quickly. Past lives aside, the sessions themselves were miserable, lasting upwards of 6 hours. Several times I seriously considered throwing the e-meter out the window. Mr. Rathbun was constantly putting words in my mouth and forcing me to confess to things that I hadn't done, just to give her any answer to her questions. If my needle wasn't responsive enough, she'd make me eat, whether I was hungry or not, likely because the e-meter is supposed to respond better when you are well fed. What I found weird was that sometimes during session breaks, Mr. Rathbun would talk to me like a friend. I got the sense that she thought my biggest problem was entitlement, that because I was from Int and my family name was Miscavige, I thought those things allowed me special treatment. Nothing was further from the truth. In my mind, my family wasn't the Miscaviges. It was my friends in the Sea Org. I was also home here, at Flag. After a few weeks of sec checks, Mr. Rathbun got tired of the whole charade, telling me in her most hostile voice that I had so many withholds that our time would be better served if I just wrote them on the computer. That way she could print them and send them to whoever it was that got them. It was much easier to confess to a computer than it was to her. At least I could write things that actually happened without being hounded and harassed. However, I would have to get meter checks along the way. When the printer wouldn't print fast enough, she would have a giant fit and scream at how much of her time I was wasting. Before long, the sec checks resumed without the computer. Besides sec checks, I had to listen again to the dreaded State of Man Congress lectures, or scrub the toilets and the tile grout in the bathrooms with a toothbrush. If Uncle Dave or Aunt Shelley were in the building I was cleaning, I was directed to eat my meals in the bathroom so they wouldn't run into me in the hallway, because I might interbulate them and thus hinder Scientology. Everything about my life made me feel trapped. I was confined to the bathroom in the WB unless I was in the auditing room with Mr. Rathbun or in another office listening to LRH tapes. I was not allowed to take the bus home, instead being driven home in a car to keep me from my friends. I was allowed a 5-minute shower, then had to go to bed. Most nights I couldn't sleep, but I couldn't go anywhere. Someone was always posted outside my door. Even the letters I received from my friends were confiscated. One evening, after I had been cleaning bathrooms for months, Mr. Rathbun came to my door to give me important news. As usual, my CO was standing right behind her. "You are done with your ethics program," she said. "You have seen the error of your ways, and so tonight you are going home." The statement was off because I was already home, here at the flag base. "Where is home?" I asked, thinking maybe she was referring to a different berthing. "Int," she replied. With that one syllable, I felt all excitement drain from my body. Flag was my home. My grandma, Aunt Denise, and my cousins all lived in Clearwater, so I finally had blood relatives nearby. All my friends were at Flag, and perhaps most important, Martino was here. As much as I'd struggled here over the years, I'd also found a happiness that I'd never known before. Now they were asking me to leave all that behind, along with the hope that I might ever again be that happy. "Am I coming back?" I pleaded. "Do I get to say goodbye to my grandmother?" I didn't dare even mention saying goodbye to my friends, and I definitely knew better than to ask about Martino. "We'll say goodbye for you," piped in my CO from behind her. "Okay," I said, stunned. I thought I would probably be back in a few days, so I took solace in that. Abruptly, the two of them came into my room and helped me shove everything I owned into some bags. I told them that I didn't need to bring everything, but they said I should, just in case. I didn't know what that meant, but it scared me. They hugged me as if we had always been great friends and said goodbye. Tom took me to the airport. I asked him to say goodbye to Martino for me, and he promised that he would. Chapter 22. L.A. I arrived in Los Angeles, my eyes swollen from crying throughout half the flight. Though I hadn't seen my parents much in the last 4 years, I had made this 3,000-mile flight quite a few times. However, I had never been this upset about it. A woman I vaguely recognized picked me up at the airport, and on the drive into the city, I quickly became mesmerized at how vibrant Los Angeles was. Stuck in the mass of morning traffic, I saw huge fashion billboards everywhere, hills in the distance, and people in droves talking to each other or hurrying along the streets. I felt like I was in a different world. I settled in for what I thought was going to be a brief pass through LA before picking up Route 60 East for our 2-hour drive to Int. Instead, the car turned into a parking lot, its gate closing automatically behind us. We crossed the street and entered a huge building I did not recognize, the Hollywood Guarantee Building. The lobby had marble walls and a soaring ceiling with a mural around the top. I still didn't know why we were here, but I decided not to ask, as the woman I was with was likely just a driver. There were other Sea Org members around, but they seemed different. They were in the old Sea Org blues, which we hadn't worn in a while. The updated uniform was less Navy style, with a different color shirt and scarf. Everybody in the dated Sea Org blues looked out of place with the rest of the Sea Org world, like I had stepped back in time. We walked past a security guard who greeted my escort, then took the elevator to the 12th floor, where I was led into a boardroom outfitted with a green carpet and a large reddish wood table with several chairs. When I looked out the window and had a chance to evaluate my situation, I felt as though I were in a bad dream looking down at an unknown world. 12 hours earlier, I might have had Mr. Ann Rathbun to deal with, but at least I knew where I was and who the people in my immediate vicinity were. Now I had no idea what would happen next. "Take a seat," my driver instructed me. "Someone will be right with you." I waited anxiously. Even though my hands were cold, my palms were sweating. I hadn't slept and I was tired, but I felt wired with worry about what was happening. 30 minutes later, in came Ann Rathbun's husband, Marty, accompanied by BJ's father and our old apartment mate, Mike Rinder, who was the head of the Office of Special Affairs. I was totally surprised to see them, but this type of twist wasn't that uncommon in my life. They smiled and asked me if I wanted anything, and I said no. Mr. Rathbun spoke first. "Look, Jenna, I don't know how else to say this other than to be direct. Ronnie and Biddy," he said, speaking of my parents, "are out of the Sea Org." His voice was blank and without emotion, and he waited for my reaction. It took me a few seconds to comprehend what he had said. I worked hard to conceal my own emotions. "What happened?" I asked coolly. "I can't really get into the details," he replied. He started to talk about where things would go from here, and as he spoke, two things became clear. First, I realized that everything I'd just been through, the months of security checks, bathroom cleaning, the CMO EPF uniform, and separation from Martino and my friends, was not because of something I had done, but because my parents were leaving the Sea Org, which surprised me and pissed me off. All that time that I had spent basically confined to the bathroom, wondering what I had done to warrant such punishment, had not even been because of something I had done. Second, I realized that the only reason I would have been put through all that was because I was being sent off, forced to accompany my parents wherever they were. I had been receiving a leaving staff sec check, which is given to members leaving, and I hadn't even known it. The stated purpose of a leaving staff sec check was to help unburden the person leaving staff of their overts and withholds, but more likely, it was to collect personal information that could later be used against the person if he spoke out against the church. I waited for Mr. Rathbun to finish before I asked bluntly, "So, now I am supposed to leave with them?" Mr. Rathbun looked guilty, but he quickly affirmed my suspicions with a small nod. "You are going to join them. The plan is you will do online Scientology courses, and when you are 18, you can come back if you want to." So much was coming at me at once that I couldn't even think. I had just come out of a nightmare, but now I was supposed to leave everything I had ever known, all my friends, my whole life, to go be with my parents, whom I had hardly seen in years, whom I spoke to infrequently, and who seemed to know nothing about me, and all because they had decided to leave the Sea Org. They were going to turn my whole life upside down right when I had just started settling in. Mr. Rathbun and Mr. Rinder were trying to be very nice and watched me as I made an effort to think. Gentle though they were being, their approach set me on edge. Through the cloud of confusion, one thing stood out clearly. The situation was not normal. Sea Org members were not usually so forgiving to family members of departing Sea Org members. It didn't matter who was to blame. Leaving was not something that was looked upon kindly. I knew that my parents were likely going to be declared SPs, so I decided to be blunt. "If I leave, I'm in the same boat as they are, aren't I?" I asked. Mr. Rathbun smiled at my quickness. He'd said I could return when I was 18, but we both knew that was a lie to placate me. He looked at Mike Rinder, who looked unsure, and then said, "Well, yes, to be honest." I looked away and thought about it more. I thought about Martino, and how Anne Rathbun had told me we could pick up where we'd left off, and how I still held out hope that was possible. I thought about my grandmother Loretta. I thought about how things had been a few months ago before Anne Rathbun called me into her office, before I started getting the sec checks, when at long last I'd finally been building a life. I thought about how strongly I felt in my commitment to help others, and how I believed that doing that through Scientology was the mission I had been born to do. I thought how Mr. Anne Rathbun might have known this all along and hadn't even let me say goodbye to anyone, and now I would never be able to speak to my friends again. I hated her, but none of her actions made me blame the church. I simply blamed her and the way she was personally applying church policy. Then I thought of my parents leaving. I grew angry just thinking about how selfish they were, that they didn't even consider or care that I had my own life now, a life that I'd been forced to create because of their choices for me. I thought about leaving all that behind. I thought about the prospect of going to a public school and being called stupid and mocked since I was so far behind. I thought about how I was all too familiar with being alone. I knew I only had a moment to say what I wanted to say before these two men would start talking for me. I had to make a decision quickly, and I went with my overwhelming gut response. I looked right at them and said, "I don't want to go." Tone 40. I was not going to take no for an answer. They looked at each other in quiet astonishment. Finally, Mr. Rathbun spoke. "What do you mean, Jenna?" "I don't want to go," I repeated, adding for emphasis, "I would rather be on the RPF than leave." Admittedly, I was kind of twitchy about that because I certainly didn't want to go in the RPF, but I wanted them to understand how serious I was. I wanted my response to be definitive. They looked at each other again, half shocked and half amused. "Someday you are going to be a huge asset to the church," Mr. Rinder said, beaming at me. Both of them had to think about what this meant and if it was even possible. They told me to wait while they discussed it outside. After about an hour, Mr. Rathbun came in and gave me a fatherly look. He told me that they were dealing with church issues other than mine, and that they wanted me to use my waiting time to study Volume 0, the church's bulky administrative policy guide filled with strategies, rules, and orders, my least favorite course. For the next several hours I pretended to be reading it, but in reality I was just staring at its green print and thinking of my future, wondering if I was going to be allowed to stay and imagining myself in a public school if I weren't. At least 8 hours went by, until finally Mr. Rathbun came back in looking flustered, accompanied by a woman. With regret, he said they had gotten tied up with some other stuff and had lost track of time, and had forgotten they had me in there. "Since it is 1 o'clock, we're just going to have you leave now," he said. "We'll deal with this in the morning." He flashed a forced smile as I said, "Okay," but there was nothing else I could do. He introduced me to Linda, the woman with him. Standing there in her Sea Org blues with a sweater, she seemed nice enough. Mr. Rathbun told me she was going to take me to a place to sleep. She smiled, and I followed her out. "See you in the morning," Mr. Rathbun exclaimed, as he waved to us both. We drove back to the same complex at the PAC base that my family had stayed at some 14 years earlier, when they were joining the Sea Org. It hadn't changed, although I couldn't remember where anything was. Inside, the Sea Org members who were still wandering around at this hour stared at us, especially me. We took the elevator to the 3rd floor, where 2 women coming from the shower wearing nothing but towels walked by us, saying, "Hi, sir," to Linda as we walked past. The room I was staying in was at the end of the hall. Linda showed me in. "Oh, good, this room has a shower," she said. "I'll meet you outside at 9 tomorrow morning." And with that she left, as I stood there gazing at myself in the mirror, wondering why so many weird things always happened to me. I didn't know that having a shower was special, but my private shower had no soap or towels, so I couldn't have been that special. I washed my whole body and face with the shampoo I brought, and dried off with a shirt from my luggage. I ignored the large cockroach crawling along the bathroom floor when I came out, closing the door behind me rather than confronting it. I sat on the bed, the dirt on the floor sticking to my feet. Someone next door was blasting music, and more people were chatting loudly outside my door. When I tried to lock it, I found it was not possible. There was no lock. Even if there had been, security and a million other people would have a master key that fit all locks, so it didn't make much difference. I opened the door to find a couple of teenagers looking back at me as though I were an alien, so I shut it as abruptly as I had opened it. There was a window in my room that kept rattling. The bright light from the Scientology sign on the roof was shining through, but there was no curtain I could close. When I finally lay down on the bed, I left the light on because I was scared. I set the alarm clock and stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. I didn't doubt my decision or the church, but I found myself picturing what life on the outside would be like. I considered what it would be like to have my own room with no post responsibilities and not having to work. Despite those thoughts, I kept getting stuck imagining myself in a public school, having to tell them that I was behind and being mocked for my ignorance. I remembered movies in which they always called on someone to answer questions in front of the whole class, and I imagined how humiliated I'd be. Then I thought about being sent to the school psychiatrist and what I would do. I cried until the light in my room went blurry and I finally fell asleep. In the morning, it took me a few minutes to find my way back to the lobby where Linda was waiting for me. We drove back to the Hollywood Guarantee Building and went into the same boardroom. Mr. Rathbun came bustling in, as though he had been awake for a while. "Hi, Jenna," he said in a friendly tone. "Did you get a good rest?" "Yes, sir," I lied. "Good, because you may need it today," he muttered with a smile. I half smiled back, hoping that this didn't mean that I would have another session. Mr. Rathbun informed me that Ronnie and Biddy did not receive the news that I wanted to stay in the church well. Mr. Rathbun and Mr. Rinder had been working on handling them, but it was not looking good. He said that my dad in particular was starting to get threatening, and he let me know that they could only do so much for me. I told him I understood, but I was amazed that my parents thought they had any sort of claim on me after they had missed so much of my life. Sure, there had been moments when I'd relied on them, more often when I was younger, but also more recently when I'd called them in the aftermath of my first EPF punishment and there was no one else to turn to. And even then, they couldn't do much to help. Besides, I could count on one hand the number of times over the last 4 years that moments like that had happened. Now, after all these years of leaving me on my own, forcing me to fend for myself, and being absent from my life, suddenly they thought they were going to start making decisions for me. Now they finally wanted to be involved in my life. Now that I was 16 and finally growing comfortable with my role in the church, now that they wanted to leave and take me with them. I had only seen them 4 times since I was 12. They weren't strangers, but in some ways, they might as well have been. I can try talking to them myself if that would help, I offered. Maybe my parents thought the church was making me stay against my will, and I could get that straightened out. Mr. Rathbun left the room and returned a few minutes later, saying, "You're going to be allowed to talk to them. I'll be listening on the other line, so don't worry." I wasn't worried, but I realized when Mom came on the line that maybe I should have been. She was fuming, and I could hear Dad in the background sounding much the same, polite, but clearly pissed off. "Jenna," my mom began, "what's going on? We were told you were coming with us. What's happened?" Before I had a chance to answer, my mom continued, "They told me that even if you didn't want to leave, you would be leaving anyway. This just shows that they clearly don't care about you or your feelings." Hearing this got me conflicted all over again. She could have said many other things if she wanted to convince me to leave. This seemed too simple to be a lie. Why would Marty and Mike have told my parents that I was going before they'd even spoken to me, then told me that they were trying to allow me to stay? Answering my question with her own speculation, she continued, "Marty and Mike have tricked you into thinking that you're going back up to Int and getting you all excited. What they really planned is dropping a bomb on you. You are just being thrown out. They're only playing with your head." Those words made me angry. I was pissed that Mom was acting like she knew anything about the way I thought. The fact that she thought I wanted to be at the Int base just showed how much she didn't know anything about my life. I didn't want to be at Int, I wanted to be at Flag. I believed she was using manipulative tactics and twisting things to make Mr. Rathbun and Mr. Rinder the enemies, when in fact, she and my dad were the ones trying to make me leave. Finally, getting my opportunity to speak, I held firm. "I don't know, Mom. Maybe you're the one who's paranoid and assuming everyone is against you." I also threw Scientology at her as well by informing her that her generalities were not accurate. One of the characteristics of an SP was that they spoke in generalities. Right after I said them, I could tell my words hurt Mom, which made me feel bad. Her response was defensive and even kind of desperate. In some ways, my wanting to stay in the Sea Org should not have come as a surprise to my mother. After all, I was learning for the first time during this call that she had been around my age when her parents had tried to get her to leave the org, and she had refused. Hearing this, I realized just how little I knew about my mother. Now she was seeing her story play out in my life, only this time she was the adult who wanted out. "You know, Jenna, people like me who leave the Sea Org, we're not just dog meat." "I know that, Mom," I said quietly, beginning to regress a little. I always felt responsible for my parents' happiness. As much as I resented them for wanting me to leave my friends and my world, I still felt guilty about making them upset. "I'm sorry. My life is here, and I want to stay." All 3 of us were silent for a moment, until I broke it. "What is that music in the background?" I asked. The whole time we were talking, weird Mexican music was coming in and out through their phone. "We're living in Cabo San Lucas, Mexico," she said. I was in disbelief, although I quickly concluded it was obviously an effort by the church to keep them off the radar, so that the news that the brother of the leader of Scientology had left the fold didn't become a PR issue. After the confrontational tone of our conversation eased, I talked with my father for a while. He continued in the same vein as my mother, expressing his concerns, but also letting me explain why I wanted to stay. He was being careful about what he said about Mike and Marty, most likely because he didn't want to alienate me, and he probably knew they were listening. Finally, both Mom and Dad agreed they would not put up a legal fight to make me leave, convinced I wanted to stay. Painful as it had been, I breathed a huge sigh of relief. When we said our goodbyes, we said we loved each other, but the one thing we didn't say was the one thing we were all thinking. None of us knew when I'd see them again. They knew as well as I that whenever it was, it would not be for a long, long time. In fact, it would be forbidden now that they were out of the church. When I hung up, I felt both relief and guilt. I felt relieved that I had won, but guilty that I had hurt my parents. Mr. Rathbun seemed happy it was all resolved, even though he was defensive about my parents blaming him and accusing him of trickery for my desire to stay. "So, where do we go from here?" he exclaimed, more of a statement of our current situation than an actual question. "I don't know," I responded, hoping he had forgotten that I had mentioned I would be willing to do the RPF just the day before. I was sent back to the boardroom, where I waited a few more hours until Mr. Rathbun fetched me, saying we were going to do a metered interview. He put on an intimidating sec-checker's demeanor, which always brought out the opposite effect in me. I was not easy to intimidate. He asked me the usual barrage of session questions. Was I hiding anything? What my true intention was for staying behind? How I felt about my family, my uncle, on and on for at least 3 hours. In the end, he could see that I wanted to stay because of my desire to be a Sea Org member, although he did discover that I had lied to his wife, Mr. Ann Rathbun, about having taken out my belly button ring, when in fact, I hadn't. Chapter 23. My Choice. I waited in the boardroom for several hours before Mr. Marty Rathbun finally returned, accompanied by 2 female RTC reps who were now going to be my guardians. The good news was that I was not being sent to the RPF. The bad news was that apparently I was not going back to FLAG either. Instead, after completion of a program, I was going to be posted in CMO in the Services Division at one of the 2 LA area CMOs, either at CMO PAC or CMO IXU. The 2 bases were only a few miles away from each other. Mr. Rathbun explained that I needed to keep a low profile, and that my new guardians were going to help me with that. He also made clear that I was not to discuss the situation with my parents or their departure with anyone. He was particularly emphatic on this point. While he was detailing all of this, I was still stuck on the only thing he'd said that really mattered. "So I am not going back to FLAG?" I said, trying to clarify, hoping I'd heard incorrectly. He responded dismissively before he even realized why I was asking. "No, we can't have this kind of security risk at the FLAG base with everything that is going on there." Then he seemed to realize that I might be upset by his words. "Don't forget, Jenna, this was your choice," he added, sounding a bit annoyed by my ungratefulness. I sank down in my seat, crushed. It might have been my choice, but I never thought I'd lose everything. It was one thing to lose my parents. Fraught as our relationship was, I was prepared for that. But losing my friends and my family in Clearwater was not something I'd anticipated. I thought I'd be allowed to go back to FLAG, back to my life. Instead, I'd been labeled a security risk and was once again being taken away from all the people I cared about, making me feel completely alone in the world yet again. Nonetheless, I said what I needed to say for the greater good. "Yes, sir." With that, he smiled at me, shook my hand, and wished me well. Then I followed my new guardians, Mr. Laura Rodriguez and Mr. Cara Hansen, out the door. I knew Mr. Rodriguez from FLAG, and Mr. H worked in RTC, but I didn't know either of them very well. We were barely to the parking lot when Mr. Rodriguez started ribbing me. "Hell on wheels," she exclaimed. I looked at her a bit confused. At FLAG, she'd audited Justin. She'd been the one who told me he was a rock slammer, so I already didn't like her. As I looked at her face, I realized that she was talking about me and that hell on wheels must have been what the RTC reps had called me. "We are going to keep you in line," she told me with a grin as she dropped me off at my room for the night. Given everything that had happened that day, I wasn't as amused as she was. She seemed to be personally offended by my lack of amusement. The next morning, I was still sleeping when she busted into my room yelling, "Rise and shine!" She was carrying a pair of pliers and headed right for me. "First things first, we are going to get that belly ring out once and for all." She demanded I stay put as she took the pliers to the stone on my ring, cracked it in half, and pulled the ring out. "Ouch!" I said, more out of indignity than pain. Next, she got out her makeup box and said that I was no longer going to be wearing my blue eyeliner. It wasn't becoming of a Commodore's messenger. Mr. Rodriguez also wanted me to wear concealer in an effort to cover up my teenaged skin. It was highly embarrassing. I put on the uniform she gave me, dark blue pants and a bright blue shirt, and she told me I looked much better. We met Mr. H outside by the RTC minivan that was going to take us to the Hollywood Guarantee Building for breakfast. Her good morning was uttered with a sarcastic smile, as though she was not overjoyed to have me intruding on her morning routine. On the way to the HGB, the two women played a Harry Potter book on tape, which, although not intended for me, was a good reprieve from conversation. I really didn't know how much more of Mr. Rodriguez's ribbing I could take. As I walked into the marble lobby of HGB, I saw two people I knew from Flag. Excited to see them, I paused to greet them. Mr. Rodriguez grabbed my arm and yanked me away, leaving them both standing there looking surprised. "Move along," Mr. Rodriguez said, urging me forward and scolding one of the people from Flag about butt-kissing. We took the elevator to the 6th floor, where the crew dining area was located. It was a large hall with folding tables, much uglier and smellier than the one at Flag. At least 5 other people who knew me started to say hi, but I waved them off, silently implying that I wasn't allowed to talk. With everyone looking at us, Mr. Rodriguez, Mr. H, and I sat at the big round exec tables toward the back of the room. Executive tables were round, while the tables for the rest of the staff were rectangular. As I looked around and saw people I knew at the various tables, I felt a little better about being at this base, though the reality was still difficult to accept. Knowing that I was with RTC reps, most of them were smart enough to keep their distance. "Miss Popular," Mr. H commented, sardonically. After a bit, a German woman came over and asked us what we wanted for breakfast. When my guardians ordered cereal, I did too. I was feeling too shy to eat, but they told me I had to have breakfast, as I had to be studentable, an adjective meaning sufficiently rested and fed to study. I reluctantly ate a little as the two of them spent most of the meal chatting. Occasionally, they'd make a comment to me, but I was so unhappy to be there I was sort of disconnected from them. After breakfast, we went downstairs to the 5th floor. Mr. H led me into a suite with 3 auditing rooms. These were the RTC auditing rooms where I was to study, do conditions, and do anything else required of me. I thought all of this was over with by now, but apparently I was wrong. My first session with Mr. Hansen was called the Truth Rundown. I was required to do this one on the grounds that I had challenged Mr. Rathbun on the morning that I had spoken to my parents. I had only questioned why they had ever been told that I would be leaving with them against my will, but the consequence of that was I now had to do a session of the Truth Rundown, a procedure to uncover the black PR, the bad propaganda, that I had been exposed to during my conversation with my parents. I was going to be directed to the moment when I had believed what my parents had told me, and once I found that, I had to locate the overt I had committed just before that moment, which had led me to believe it. Looking back now, I see it was the ultimate brainwashing technique. When I tried to insist to Mr. Rodriguez that my mother had most likely been telling me the truth, as indeed Mr. Rathbun and Mr. Rinder were planning to send me on my way, she wouldn't hear any of it. Eventually, I made up some moment in time and its earlier